Thank you so much for coming and having me here. I'm super excited to be presenting this program. I'm not sure how articulate I'm going to be, but I'm going to try. I'm feeling actually a little bit emotional because this space means a lot to me, this specific room. I've taken many film studies courses in this room, and I've taught my own first film studies course in this room on Palestinian cinema. And there are a few people here who I just feel moved by being. Rosanna Mowley was my teacher in my undergrad, and it's been like 13 years since, in my relationship to Concordia. And my best friend, Ronald, is here, who I met in this room, and we did a presentation together on Claire Denis films, so I feel very honored to be in this space. I also want to start with some thank yous. First and foremost to Michelle Telliot, who I feel we've been having really inspiring and fruitful conversations from a year ago, and the program, the collaboration came out of that. And it's unbeknownst to her. I've never told you this, Michelle, but Michelle's been a mentor of mine since I've been doing my when I did my graduate work here at Concordia. And I'm very honored to have to be presenting this screening as part of the Ellen Gallery programming. And also, I really want to thank Robin very much for working so hard to organize and coordinate this screening. I know there's a lot of behind-the-scenes work that gets done, and I know Robin worked really hard, and others at Ellen Gallery as well. I want to also thank Juan for agreeing to be my collaborator this evening in having a conversation about the program afterwards. And I also want to thank Jean-Francois, who also was projecting for me when I taught my first course here. So I feel like it's a very special evening. I just wanted to say a few words before I started about where the program kind of came from, where the idea came from, and why I contextualized it the way I did. Futurist Myths was very much inspired by my own engagement with Deleuze's cinema books and his concept of fabulation. And I just want to say that because I feel that there's a lot of programming on science fiction programming and especially using the concept futurism and futurity in recent and contemporary art scenes. And so I wanted to just acknowledge that while I'm aware of a lot of the work and the history and the legacy of Afrofuturism and Afro-Surrealism, I wanted to say that this particular work came out of this concept that I've been grappling with for some time. I do want to acknowledge the work of D. Scott Miller, who wrote this incredible manifesto called the Afro-Surreal Manifesto, which is accessible online, and his work is something I'm engaging with now, and I wanted to also just throw that out there in that sense, because his concept of Afro-Surrealism is very much close to what Deleuze speaks of as fabulation, and I'm just going to quote D. Scott Miller here. He says that Afro-Surrealism addresses the radical imagination of the diaspora and its influence on Western civilization, pop culture, and theory. I see the term Afro-Surreal and its various appellations as both a descriptive and practice of seemingly disparate elements and cultures, narratives merging to emphasize their similarities in a wholly new culture and narrative. With that said, though, my intention here is not to also negate my own process when it comes to learning and researching around this idea of futurity. And I wanted to really think through what it meant to. I wanted to think through what it meant to go beyond what Deleuze said and expand on his idea of fabulation. And it's a quote. I just realized not everybody has a program, so I'm going to just quote how I started off the text. An act of fabulation which would not be a return to myth, but a production of collective utterances capable of raising misery to a strange positivity, the invention of a people. And where I was coming with that was really had a lot to do with how I understood to come to know, how to come to hold knowledge through intuition, intimacy, and tenderness, and how that forms a practice of making. I understood while I was reading up on fabulation that knowledge is constituted by how we experience what we want to express. This is what I meant by futurist myths, is that as artists, curators, and writers, we get to decide how to frame and compose our thought, how we want to express that, and communicate those expressions in a way that's shareable, that is contextualized in an insightful manner. And I do think that this is often done through the poetic imaginary and through a poetic composition of an image. And when I say poetry, and I want to be careful here because I'm also suspicious of how poetry's been co-opted into the art world recently as well. And I want to just really emphasize, when I say poetry, I'm talking about rhythm, how rhythm gathers, creates intimacy, how these films create a rhythm that leads us into a process of thinking and feeling together. And I want to just quote the great poet Fred Moten, who writes of poetry. He says, "Poetry investigates new ways for people to get together and do stuff in the open, in secret. Poetry enacts and tells the open secret. Getting together and doing stuff is a technical term that means X, something going on at the sight and sound center of sweet political form." And in this sense, I wanted to really think about what it means to see these images, see these films in the context of a political form that's very much contextualized from within a poetic process. And I wanted to also think about what it means to think about conceptualization not as something that is outside of the body, but that's something that's very much embodied. And I feel a lot of the films might, for me anyway, really get at that. I think I'll just stop here because I don't really want to talk too much about the films. I'll let you watch them, and then we can elaborate on those ideas and concepts together afterwards with Juan. And we can, we'll have an open discussion afterwards. Thank you so much for coming. I tortured you on purpose with that last one, just to get you excited for what we're going to be talking about. I feel like because we ran out of the programs, I would love to read over the descriptions of the films, if that's okay with you guys. I feel like it would be helpful.
Sure. Yeah.
Except I don't have a program.
Oh, I do. That one's kind of blurry by some reason, but can you see it?
Mm-hmm. So the first film we saw was by Noor Abid, who is a Palestinian filmmaker based in Ramallah and in LA. It was called Penelope, and it was inspired by the Odyssey based on Homer's epic poem from Greek mythology. This work is based on the concept of myth, its position in history and relation to the present and the imaginary. This film was shot in Palestine, attempting to reflect a reality other than the one history offers. Here, myth could be seen as a collective dream and public imagination. The second one we saw was by Kristen Lee, who is here, I think, still. Is that right? Can't see you. And hopefully she'll be able to also participate in the discussion along with Milena. Kristen Lee's Two Snakes is an experimental animation and documentary about diasporic desires for foundational myths, seeking a home in reclaimed ancestry and seeking a self in reappropriated narratives and finding fragments instead. Features original score by Julie Matson. Milena Schlam, who's also here, her film Lunar Almanac uses in-camera editing and frame-by-frame photography to create multi-layered field views of the phases of the moon. Dylan Mira's Untitled Agua Viva features the filmmaker's ailing father reading aloud from Clarice Lispector's Agua Viva from his home hospital bed. His recitation is punctuated by his announcements of distaste for the book, as well as by the acerbic tender commentary from his wife and her husband's character and life. Basil Abbas and Rowan Aburahmi's Only the Beloved Keeps Our Secrets. Actually, they did me a really big favor, and usually they only show their work in an installation in a gallery space with multiple screens in front of one another. This is the first time they allowed it to be screened in a cinema. And it's a brand new work, it's 2016. Only the Beloved Keeps Our Secrets is structured around footage taken from an Israeli military surveillance camera. On March 19th, 2014, 14-year-old Youssef Shawamreh crossed the separation fence erected by the Israeli military near Hebron. He was going to pick akab, an edible plant that grows at high altitudes and blooms for only a short period of time and is a delicacy in Palestinian cuisine. Israeli forces ambushed him and shot him dead. After a court injunction, the military surveillance footage was released and consequently circulated online. The piece invites us to consider the forms of entanglement between the destruction of bodies and the erasure of images, and the conditions under which these same bodies and images might once again reappear. The last one we saw was by Colleen Smith, called Remote Viewing, and she wrote this small description for it. I heard the story of a man who, as a boy, watched the whites in his town try to erase every track of the black community by digging a deep hole and burying the Negro schoolhouse in it. There was this horrible intersection between the sublime and the obscene in the man's description. What does it mean that your need for erasure would be so intense that you would dig a hole and bury a whole structure underground? That took me right back to the land art guys. So that was the beginning. I had to work very quickly. The scale of the project was so huge that once a piece of land and money became available, I had to make the film or never make it.
Hi.
Hi.
So thank you for inviting me to do this, and to Robin. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah. So I have a bit of a partial list of questions for Nasrin to expand on the films that we just saw and the ideas that she had in her statement, but I highly encourage you to join us in conversation. We'll have a Q&A at the end, but if you want to jump in, there's a microphone here at the front, so feel free to raise your hand or something. I guess I'll go right into it. But I'm going to start on a bit of a personal note, I guess, and it might be, I guess, a bit of a tangent, but after watching the films for the first time, one of the first ideas that I had was about magical realism. And I guess one can totally see why a genre like magical realism would, be born in Latin America, since it's a place where the fantastical and the mythical they're sort of interwoven in everyday life. And also where sort of like the bizarre and the banal are completely intertwined. So I was thinking about this in relation to some of the ideas that you wrote in the program, specifically about the political potential of or relevance of something like fabulation or myth making. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
I really don't want to take credit for that because I came up with the idea when I watched Noor's film, which was the first film you saw. When I first saw it, I didn't read the title or read any of the description. And then afterwards, when I realized it was based on Penelope, I really started to think about the ways in which there's power in thinking through, cutting through, remanipulating, and reconstituting what we know as myth into something that could be read in present day, especially in the context of Palestine. I thought it was pretty powerful to have Penelope be a figure on a roof that's like a mermaid, and it was an outfit made out of fish. And I thought that was so powerful when I saw that film. So that my main idea came, when I saw the film, I was also reading, I I had gone back to read Gilles Deleuze's The Time Image, and that's where the quote comes from: an act of fabulation which would not be a return to myth, but a production of collective utterances capable of raising miseries to a strange positivity, the invention of a people. And so when I kind of related to two and associated the concept of myth-making into the idea of fabulation, in the sense of how it is that there's a real sense of autonomy in terms of reclaiming histories and memories when it comes to constituting new stories.
And I guess also specifically within terms of film and the image, like I'm thinking about the potential for art to operate in the realm of the image and the dream world of the popular imagination towards seeking change, as opposed to other sort of like more tangible or practical ways of operating. So I wonder if you can talk about that.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of how deep I can go into this. I think maybe I'll just begin by saying that my position as a curator who often programs films from Palestine or by Palestinian filmmakers, I try to tend to not contextualize it from within the rhetoric of occupation and look for work that really cuts through that narrative. So I also maybe want to add to the first part of your question too, which is that for me it was really important to think of ways of watching and thinking about images from Palestine in different contexts and the power that comes with that when it comes to thinking about what art can do in that context. So for me it's not very much, for me it was, as a curator, it's always important to think about, like I also mentioned in the introduction, how insightful context can be and what the power of that is as well, and the intensity of that when it comes to receiving information from the images we're given.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think also like in political theory or practice, there's usually a very narrow realm of possibilities, available to us. And I think that's how I see the sort of like the power, the potential of something like a speculation or fabulation for sort of opening up that range of possibilities. My second sort of question has to do with this idea of artists constructing myths, which I was really interested in, this idea of manipulated and existing ones, or sort of like the play between fiction and documentary, which you see often in some of the films or the videos. And I was thinking that this approach has a lot of value for revealing the constructiveness of things that often appear, natural or given, like history or identity or race. So like, in a way, like if you consider these things as being made up, you can manipulate them and shape them as any other material. So I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about fabrication in this sense, particularly in relationship to history and mythology. That's a really good question. It's getting me stuck a bit because I'm like a great believer, and Robin and I haven't had a chance to argue about this yet, but I want to argue with him about it. I'm a really great believer that content comes from form and not the other way around. So I would agree as well.
That's why I love Milena's work. But it's also, for me, when I think about fabrication and construction and creation, and when it comes to the content of these films, my immediate attraction is how it's made, and that's obvious in a lot of the films. So the first one, that's pretty obvious why. The images are really beautiful. They're composed very well. They're the mise en scène is very powerful. Same with Rowan and Basil's work, and same with Milena's, obviously. And then there are ones that stick out, and Kristen Lee's, of course. And then there are ones that stick out, like Dylan's. So Dylan Mira, who films her father in his hospital bed. And for me, it was so much that, for example, when I think about fictive mythologies and how I would contextualize why I put this film in this program, I really was thinking a lot about how the process was creating, how the process of making was creating what was happening. And so she was filming in the instant, and that took place. So whatever that, the kind of choreography between her father and him reading and her mother and her behind the camera was really constituting an effect and a rhythm that I felt very much pulled by, and that I felt memorialized this moment that they were having together. So for me, like you're talking about fabrication or fabulation, has a lot to do with the power of production in that way, and what it is that you can do with with the kind of the rigor of attention. Does that make sense?
And as a kind of segue, because something that you were talking about, the relationship between poetry and politics at the beginning. So I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about that as well, because I thought it was really interesting what you were saying in the introduction.
I've been a long-time poetry reader. Same with philosophy. And I feel like poetry for me is something that is like written for and made for the people. And lately I've been seeing it in contexts that give it a kind of different spin. And I've just been extremely careful about how I use it in my work, because for me, it's a sacred practice in terms of what can happen with language, with process, with rhythm, with affect, and I feel that it's very specific to how one experiences reading it. That often these days, in terms of the contemporary art scene, I've been finding it difficult to engage with it on that level and wondering why. So for me, it comes from really thinking about being a little bit annoyed at that, and also wanting to figure out a way around it for myself, and why it's important for me to what's the relationship that I have with poetry, and how do I want to deal with that. That's what it's made me think about more.
Okay. Okay. Something else that came into my head was this idea of construction versus destruction or erasure. And then I thought that you can see it as a kind of motif in some of the works. And I mean, when something is being constructed in history, like, you know, a myth or what have you, or a folkloric tale, it appears that something else is being erased as well. A very relevant example, I guess, is the last, work that we saw by Colleen Smith. And then you actually have, tractors and excavators in the video as a kind of literal representation of that. And you see actual excavators in another video as well, I think, in Only the Beloved Keeps Their Secrets. So I don't think I built in a question in here, but if you want to
maybe,
talk about that.
Or can we open it up?
Sure, yeah.
And maybe we can take some comments or questions. A prof of mine always told me when there's silence in the classroom to count to 10 seconds until someone speaks, which
Put the pressure on them. That is like 2 seconds at least. Sure.
Sorry, congratulations. Is it working? Yeah, congratulations on the program, the presentation. I really enjoyed the discussion. I don't really have a question, actually. I just wanted to comment on something that has not been sort of discussed or asked by the question, and it's the materic sort of intertwining of the selection of your presentation, which I think has a lot to do in both on what you were commenting on about the process making of myth, but also I think in the ways in which this selection is very Deleuzian informed. It's a very post-subjective sort of thinking also of how we tell and we form myth. Can you comment on this? Because I really love the ways in which the films were really sort of really stressing the materic side of the ways in which they were telling stories.
Yeah. Yeah.
From the fish to the sun to
the moon. The snakes, yeah. I mean, yeah, I guess it was that's a really hard question. I guess it was really, first, it's always really hard for me to describe why I put things in order the way that I do, but honestly, it's often intuitive. But I really wanted to start with Noor's because it was really just because her work inspired the entire idea of the program. And then because the program is so focused on myths and mythologies, I don't think it could help itself but be representative of so many different elements in terms of the materiality and what you were talking about in terms of seeing, the different elements and materials in the actual films. But I really want to stress though that the way that I thought about the program had really so much to do with how I felt each rhythm enabled the next. And so for me, it really came from that, and the structure came out of how I felt it moved me, and often then I hope that it works for the audience. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
Does anybody else have a question? Can I ask you another question? Okay. I personally believe that there's a kind of efficacy to storytelling for communicating ideas and concepts by the way that it sort of like, it stays in memory and works on the imagination. And I think if you haven't read Nasrin's statement on the program, I highly encourage you to do that. It's going to enrich, the experience if you haven't seen the films. But you mentioned in that statement that you were interested in this process between affect and invention. I was wondering if maybe you can talk about this. Or also about storytelling in general.
I'm just laughing because I feel like I say this all the time, and I'm not sure if it's changing now, but I often say I'm this shameless lover of Deleuze, but I think I'm becoming more shameful about it. Only because the way that I think about affect and invention really for me comes from having read him so intensely in my undergrad and in my graduate schooling. But also for me, I put that line in because I was really thinking a lot about these specific films and the artists. What I think the artists were doing was really being moved by something that caught their attention, and from there created these films for these ideas, not just the idea, but the way that they were going to be filmed, And I feel, Kristen and Milena are here, so I feel like they should also speak, maybe if they want to, about their own work. But I really felt like when I was thinking about that, I was also thinking about the impulse to articulate, articulate something that seems inaccessible to communicate. And I was thinking a lot about that in relation to the power of poetry and language, and that in terms of how you play with language and poetry is also for me so much about how experimental film plays with the form and material. And so I was thinking a lot about how that instigates or also inspires invention, like literally. So like Malena's film is in camera editing, and that's pretty intense in terms of how to work a camera and to do it. I mean, Malena can speak to that. I have no idea what she does, but it's pretty powerful. But it's, you know, so that's where I was coming at it from. Like it's really literal in the sense of what it is that you can do with the material at your hands.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Something else that I noticed that I thought it was really interesting within this idea of fictive mythologies is not only for envisioning possible futures, but also for revising history as well. Yeah. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that or questions about that.
I wonder if Kristen, would you like to speak about your work at all? Putting you on the spot.
Yeah, I don't have a question for you, Kristen. I just tried to come up with one.
I'm just filling time maybe, but something else I came across that I thought it was really interesting in relationship to this program was a book that maybe some of you have heard of. It's called The Magic of the State. It's by this anthropologist named Michael Taussig. And it's basically a book about how the state is possessed by, you know, past historical figures, and possessed as in like, you know, spirit possession, and like past historical figures as in like dead presidents and dead politicians. And then you see it constantly repeated in the mythologies of the state and, you know, names of schools and streets and whatnot. But anyways, the book is about this in relationship specifically to the history of South America. And he tells the story through two characters that he makes up. And there's a really, like a real blend between fact and fiction. And he actually calls it fictive criticism as a way of, approaching history and criticizing, but also using the possibilities of narrative, I guess, as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think, yes. No, please, you go.
Hi, I just have a question about, because there's a lot of interest that about future in this programming and the way you, I guess the films that one thing that I got from all this film is the positivism or the optimism towards the future in terms of, I guess, the way the artists were making. And there are, you know, it's very loaded with very, you know, like actual circumstances, like that, what's going on around the world, the problem with displacement and political conflicts and racism and all that stuff, like that's all in the film. And I'm just, as an artist, I am an artist who is often thinking about this and what's the relationship between art and politics and what art can do in terms of, so I guess, I don't know, my question would be for you, what do you think is, because I feel that it could be a certain form of escapism also in this kind of production of work. If I guess what do you think of the role of art in, or role of this form of production in today's contemporary society? It's a big question.
Yeah.
I mean, as a curator, what do you see yourself in it?
Well, I'll take like the example of Rowan and Basil's work in Beloved, and that's like a really intense event, you know, of a little kid who crossed the border or the fence to harvest some of this plant and then gets killed by the military. I find their work extremely interesting because I think, like I was mentioning before, I'm not one to, I'm more interested in what it is that images can do to really disrupt the kind of politics as usual rhetoric that we always hear about, say, Palestine. And that for me, I feel there's real power in changing those kinds of images and recontextualizing them in order to, for me at least, to help me think better and think differently. So I can't answer that question, but all I know is that as a curator, the way that I want to be responsible when I present this kind of work is that I want to be able to really be very intentional about what it is that I'm doing and how I'm defining what I'm doing. So in this context, when I was thinking about the title Futurist Myth, I was really thinking about what it means to like cut through how we see or how we envision a world that's to come, and rather focus on how the world is being recreated through these kinds of images that we see in the present day, and that the future is of the present and not of something that's to come. And that's what I'm interested in politically, that it's in how it's being created, how the present is being challenged, and how images are able to do that in terms of what they can capture when it comes to the struggles that we hear about and face. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Hi. I'm wondering if you could address sound in this work. I was thinking particularly of the first film, which has no sound and has a muteness that in fact makes the tension and rhythm very, very strong. It's almost as if there was sound, it would have taken away from it. And there's sound, of course, and all, but also in the Beloved film where, you know, it's always, the sound is like disrupts and in a sense makes it that the image is always not unified. Do you know what I mean? It's always kind of broken up. And I don't know what role that played in your selection of works too, you know.
You know, funnily enough, I never think about sound. but to say that again, it's like when I was thinking about the order of films, I was thinking about the rhythm, and I think the silence and sound obviously play a huge role in that. In Rowan and Basil's film, they actually think of themselves as sound artists first. So, and they don't separate the idea of they don't separate image from sound when they're composing each frame. And so I feel like that's why it's highly effective in that regard. Where I feel like, and in Kristen's film, it was soundtrack was created by Julie Mattson, who's an incredible musician. So I feel like those kinds of collaboration, are able to create a different effect. But I also always love to have silence in the program, but also laughter. Like I also positioned Dylan's film in the middle because I needed a break from the intensity of the rest of the film. So it was helpful for me to also think about sound in that regard in terms of the audience. Yeah.
I was thinking about sound as well, and I thought it was really interesting for only the Beloved also, but also for Colleen Smith video, remote viewing, especially because, I don't know, I kept thinking that the sound might be it's non-diegetic when it's external, or I always confuse diegetic and non-diegetic.
Non-diegetic, I think, is
Is external,
Yeah.
yeah. Because you never really hear the tractors as they would like normally sound if it was being recorded. Like you don't hear the motor as much, and you hear cars, but you never really see them go by. So it's sort of like a strange kind of soundscape that at times doesn't kind of really make sense, or doesn't really. But I thought it went well with that green screen in the back, because it's sort of like, you know, that usual sort of like green screen and things out of a film. So it's kind of like this process of make believe or something. But
Yeah, I think because it's also, she was going back to this a past event. So I feel like it helped in terms of thinking about time in that way too. Yeah.
Any last questions?
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
another one.
This is more of a comment. I found the selection very powerful, and also something about grief really struck me, and I wonder if that's why more people aren't talking. And I couldn't help but think about grief and its relationship to optimism. And sort of, I felt like your selection was a very complex kind of gesture about some kind of letting go that happens when people decide to be strategically optimistic under circumstances that are hard, to put it very simply. And I thought that was really striking, and was curious like what your thoughts are around mourning and grief and futurism, and also something that you said about escapism in relation to like a politicized piece or politicizing artwork, that of course initially I like wanted to challenge, but I also really appreciated that word as sort of a charged, contested word in relation to when we politicize work. And it made me think about the grief, actually, that word escapism, and this idea of when we create fictional narrative or fictional futures, how in a way it could be seen as a crafted escape, but maybe perhaps it's more of a very tangible way to create a new opening. And it just made me curious, your thoughts around mourning and grief in relation to futurism, futurity,
Right.
as you said.
Yeah. Yeah, I avoided your escapism comment earlier too. It's true. Thank you. I actually didn't, that word never entered my thought process for sure when I was putting the program together, but
The escapism?
grief.
Grief.
Yeah, grief and mourning. And it's I'm feeling all of a sudden like it's hard for me to talk about my work or how I think through it. But I think this was like an intensely personal program. Yeah. And I think it like came at a time where when I was thinking about it and putting it together, I was it's like so selfish in a way, because when I was thinking about it, I mean, I guess maybe a lot of us do this, but I was thinking about really all the shit I've been seeing, you know, like just really awful crap. And that it's like, that makes me either feel worse about what's going on in the world, or in a way that's not helpful, or just leaves me kind of, you know, empty. And so I was really trying to, as a curator, I often just want to be, I'm, you know, like presenting the artist's work. It's not mine, right? And this is what I just want to really emphasize, that my position here is just to really think through the power of the work and what it does. And so I often, but with that said, I'm often thinking about it in relation to myself, so what it's doing to me, and then hoping that it would have an effect. In terms of grief and mourning, I think you're totally right on, because, and I never really thought about it that much before, but I mean, that's just something I sit with always. You know, it's not something that I feel like leaves my work when I write or think or feel, because of the state of the world. And so I always want to see something that is rigorous enough, that gives us a sense of rigor in terms of what the presentation can be, and at the same time take us further in terms of thought. And I really want to stress that. I only really love watching things and being moved by things when it's like I've never thought about that before, or I'm jarred by the actual what I'm receiving from the images I see. Yeah. And I also want to stress that often and that goes back to what you're saying about affect. That's what I often think affect does, is really it moves me into a position where I find it hard to articulate what I'm feeling, and I feel that's the power of the images, and that's when I know something's happening, and I think that's the strange positivity that I was also trying to get at in the text for the program. Yeah. Thanks.
I think there was one last question in the back.
You kind of answered the question that I was about to ask, because you mentioned earlier that contemporary art is kind of lacking this level of reading where affect, process, rhythm, all these qualities that you're looking for are absent. And I wonder if poetic works possess this ability to perhaps engage us further, or what do you think the role of having a poetic charge in a work?
Yeah, I was thinking when I wrote in the text that there's, I think I wrote something like, I'll just bring it up, that the Futurist Myths honors the poetic composition of an image. I was really thinking, and I mentioned this at the beginning, that I was really wanting to stress rhythm and how it really pushes us into the movement of the actual image. And for me, that's what I meant by, that's what I mean by kind of poetics, is that it really has a lot to do with the kind of how you get taken up by the rhythm of whatever it is that you're receiving as a viewer. And it might not work for everybody, or, you know, it depends on, obviously, preference, but yeah.
So you don't think poetry is democratic in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, sure.
It's not for everyone.
It's not for everyone. I feel like we should finish. That was a really good note to end on, though, for the love of poetry.
Thank you so much for staying.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nasrin.
Those were really good.